guys, it's Tori, and this week I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite authors of all time, Thomas Hardy. Several months ago, I made a video about another one of my favorite authors, Shannon Hale, and I have been wanting to make it a series of just talking about authors, their background, some common themes amongst their books, if I'm able to recognize those, and things like that. I just haven't gotten around. I want to definitely make sure I've read multiple of an author's works before I make one of these videos, and there's only so many of those, plus I just have had a lot of other videos I wanted to film before this one, so finally getting around to another author video talking about Thomas Hardy. So to start off, Thomas Hardy was born June 2nd, 1840 in Higher Bockhampton, Dorset, England. I probably totally butchered that town name, but it was a very secluded town. He lived basically a very pastoral lifestyle, which is why the majority of his books are set in that sort of setting. As he grew up, he originally wanted to be an Anglican priest. However, as he grew up, between lack of money in his family and his decrease in religious faith, he ended up turning to other opportunities. He spent a lot of time reading poetry, and he fell in love with poetry. He wanted to be a poet. However, he wasn't seeing a lot of success. Most poets at the time didn't see a ton of revenue coming in from it, so he reluctantly turned to prose, which is very funny because honestly I feel like I enjoy his prose better than his poetry, but he enjoyed writing poetry. He did his whole life, but he found a lot more success writing prose, so that's what he ended up doing. As far as marriage goes, he was married twice. First to Emma Gifford in 1874. They were about the same age. They were both about 30. And while the first few years were full of a lot of love, as time went on, they lost a lot of that and really struggled. There was a lot of tension in their marriage. However, when she passed away due to health problems, he wrote a lot of wonderful poetry about his wife and his love for her. A couple years later, he married Florence in 1914. He was 74 at the time and she was about 35, 34. And while that marriage started off happy, it also struggled a lot. There was a lot of tension there as well. He ended up passing away in 1928, and she passed away 9 years later in 1937 of cancer. Some common themes in many of Hardy's works is strong women who, despite a lot of social pressure, are able to work hard and gain some greater social status. Of course, there are still limitations to them. He's very realistic about it, which I appreciate, while also showing that women can be just as intelligent and hardworking and devoted as men can, and it is wonderful. He also focuses in a lot on marriage and what makes a solid, long-lasting marriage. Many of the marriages in his books, unlike his own, were fairly happy. A common theme is many of the marriages in his books that don't work out are usually because they're based on lust and passion rather than real solid foundations that will last. For the marriages that work, they commonly have social statuses that are very similar, or they have something having to do with just life in general, whether that be their ability to work hard, their ability to and desire to learn and progress. Those things, when they have those solid foundations beyond just the lustfulness, they tend to be happier, stronger, firmer marriages. That's one of my favorite things about Hardy's books, is he doesn't degrade marriage as a horrible aspect of society, but as something that needs to be approached with the right amount of respect and the right amount of understanding of what exactly you're getting into, which likely came from a lot of his experiences in marriage. In his personal life, he also had a lot of strong opinions about divorce and its need to be a little bit more available to people, particularly in bad situations where there's no happiness in the marriage. So those are common themes throughout his books. The first book he ever wrote is Desperate Remedies. This book follows a woman named Cytherea. A lot of Hardy's characters have strange names. Anyway, who is well beloved by this man named Edward, but because of poverty, she has to take a job as a lady's maid, in this house with this eccentric older lady who Cytherea's father actually was in love with but was unable to marry. So it's slightly awkward situation there. And also she ends up finding out that Edward, the man who she is in love with, is engaged to a woman he does not love. And amongst all this crazy drama, she ends up accepting the help of the lady she's working for's nephew, who is very mysterious, doesn't seem to be a great guy. In fact, his first wife mysteriously died in a fire, and that's all I really know about it. A lot of drama. This is definitely based on what I've studied and what I've read by Thomas Hardy. This definitely seems to be one of the most dramatic, like almost soap opera-y like synopses, but I know Thomas Hardy and I know it's gonna be a lot more sophisticated than a soap opera, but still just kind of that, a lot of drama and craziness going on, and I've heard really good things about this. This is one I'm actually most excited to read that I have not read yet. So there's also Under the Greenwood Tree. This is a more lighthearted novel that follows the romance between this young architect and a schoolmistress. Just follows their love story. It's fairly short. This is actually the next Hardy I'm planning to read in the month of August. The next book he wrote was A Pair of Blue Eyes. This follows a girl named Elfried, I think is how you pronounce it, who is basically in a love triangle with this man named Stephen, who's an architect. I don't know what it is with Hardy and architects, by the way, but a lot of his young attractive men tend to be architects. I think that his father was in that field of work, and so that's probably partly why. But anyway, there's also Henry Knight, who's a little more sophisticated than Stephen, he being a writer. However, he's not super experienced with love and everything. These men, not only are they both vying for her attentions, they also are really good friends, and so a lot of drama ensues, particularly when Stephen, who has been away, comes back into town. This book, Alfred, the main character, is actually based on his first wife, Emma Gifford. This is heavily based on his romance with her. So the next book that Hardy wrote, and one of his most famous novels, is Far from the Madding Crowd. This is a book I have read and is one of my favorite books of all time. We follow Bathsheba Everdeen, who goes from being a poor orphan girl to inheriting her uncle's farm, and she takes on the challenge. She is very free-spirited, but there are three men vying for her attentions. There's Gabriel Oak, the poor shepherdsman who previously asked her to marry him and she turned him down. There's also Mr. Boldwood, the wealthy landowning neighbor of her farm, and Sergeant Troy, who is the sexy sergeant in an army. It is such an incredible book. I know several of these will have like love shapes, you'll notice, but Thomas Hardy does them so incredibly, just because in his culture, like, a love triangle is not like, I love them both and I don't know which one I want most of the time. It's usually more like, okay, he's wealthy and he can give me a secure place. Is that what I want? Or I love him, we have a healthy, strong love, or he's really attractive. And it's basically focused on what the woman wants out of life, more than just which one do I love the most kind of a thing. So don't let those things turn you off, because he does them amazingly. And a lot of the time there's often even a man that she's not really interested in, he's just more interested in her, but there's still a slight draw there in certain situations, or sometimes she's just never interested and he's just kind of there. So anyway, next is another book that I read. It's actually the last book I read by Thomas Hardy most recently, and that was The Hand of Ethelberta. This is actually one of Hardy's least favored of his novels, which is very strange because I love this book. But this is a social satire following a girl named Ethelberta who has grown up in a poor family, but she's very intelligent. She ends up marrying this wealthy man who is disowned by his family. However, just 3 weeks after the marriage, he dies, and this book starts off with her living with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law makes this deal with her that she's able to live with her, that the mother-in-law will take care of her so long as she does not remain in consistent contact with her family, and that nobody should know who her family is below stairs. She ends up becoming a writer. She writes a book of poetry that was very well received, as well as starts to be a oral storyteller. I loved it. I thought it was very funny. I loved the characters. I can see why some people wouldn't like it quite as much. Nowadays, to some people it might be a little more boring, but I really liked it. Next was The Return of the Native, which follows a small town, Egdon Heath, that is very close-knitted community. However, there's this boy named Clem, I think is how you say it, who returns from doing something, I'm not completely sure, but he ends up falling in love with this girl there, and there's a lot of drama that ensues amongst the town. There's a lot of internal struggles within the characters in this. It's very character driven, it sounds like. Next was The Trumpet Major, which is a story of love and war, basically. I think there's 3 suitors chasing after this woman, but it's heavily influenced by the war with Napoleon, as each of these men is participating in some way in this war, and I don't know much more than that. So I have heard Lucy from Lucy the Reader say that this is one of her least favorite Thomas Hardy's, so I'm not sure what to make of that, but I'll definitely still read it just to see how I feel when I get to it. In 1881, he wrote a book that is the only Thomas Hardy I don't own yet. I'm still working on getting to a point where I can get it, but that is a Laodicean. This one follows a girl who inherits this large castle, hires this architect to help her fix it up and everything, and she ends up falling in love with him, but she's also in love with a captain. Based on what I've read about this book, it seems like a lot of the focus is on her vacillation and ambiguous opinions in politics and religion, a lot of uncertainty in a lot of areas of her life, including with these men, and it's said to reflect Hardy's own opinions that were constantly in shift, and he wasn't completely grounded in a lot of ways throughout his life on his opinions in politics and religion. Next was a more romantic, it seems to be a more lighthearted story while still being a little soap opera-y, in the intense drama department, if that makes sense, like Desperate Remedies was the first book. But that is Two on a Tower. This one basically follows a woman by the name of Viviette, who is married. However, her husband ends up abandoning her and going off to hunt in Africa. As such, she is left to her own devices and not having anything to do. She kind of wanders around trying to figure out what to do with her life, and she meets this young astronomer, and they fall in love. They delve into an affair and secret marriage. However, her first husband is still alive, so there's a lot of drama with that there. And this one's also another one that's fairly short. Finally, next we're getting to another one that I have actually read, so I can tell you a little bit more about. The Mayor of Casterbridge. This one is one of Hardy's most popular tragedies. This follows a man who is a drunk, and he has a wife and daughter who he ends up in a drunken fit selling to this sailor, and after that day he swears off drinking for the next 30 years is what he says. He ends up being successful in business and becoming the mayor of this town. However, his past comes back to haunt him while he's in that position. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't love it quite as much as I've loved the other Hardys that I read, and I think primarily it's because I didn't connect with the characters as well. The main character being a man who's middle-aged by the time we get to him, and so I feel like I just struggled connecting with him as a character just because, I'm a young adult female, so in a completely different time period. So I didn't like it quite as much. I also found some of the characters to be a little more irritating in this one. Not in a good way, like they're supposed to be irritating, more in a way that I'm I just didn't like them. But I know a lot of people do love this book. It's one of his more popular ones. I'm sure if a guy read this, they might like it a little bit more. Or if you go into this knowing that maybe the main character might be a little harder to connect to as a woman, maybe it'll prepare you enough to enjoy it a little bit more. I'm sure I'll reread this in the future and maybe I'll like it better then. It's still Hardy. I still love his writing. And there is a character in this that I do really, really enjoy. So also there's a Scottish boy in this who is great. Next, he wrote The Woodlanders. This follows Grace Melbury, who is very well educated, very intelligent, who returns to her hometown and is unable to marry the man that she was intended for, and so she ends up choosing someone else, but it ends up having disastrous consequences. I know that's very vague, but that's all I know about it. I do know that in the end, despite all this drama and craziness, there is a happy ending. I have heard amazing things about this, about the main character, and I'm excited to pick it up. The last book that was part of his middle of his career as a writer was The Well-Beloved. This one, I could read the back to you, but I just am so confused by what this is about. Okay, basically there's this lady, I'm gonna do my best, because every time I read this, I still just am like, what? I don't get it. So anyway, there's a lady named Jocelyn who basically has this ideal, not necessarily of beauty, but of like a well-beloved, someone who can be appropriate for all situations and be liked by basically almost any type of person. However, they still have that sense of like who they are. So they're not like wishy-washy and just changing all the time. They're like able to have like a center who they are, but they're able to approach all sorts of different people, I think. And there's this family of 3 generations of women. So there's Avis something, and then her daughter and her granddaughter, who are very loved by Jocelyn. They're very close. This is where it gets confusing because I don't know if it's like a misprint on my copy, if it's supposed to say her or him. Anyway, basically there's someone fails to marry the person who they're meant to marry, and then there's like 2 other, yeah, I'm so confused. But anyway, 2 other people that she's interested in. Also, some like fun little added in is Jocelyn is a sculptor, so she's very successful in that field. And again, so confused. I probably should just look up another explanation of what this is about, but it's fine. It's one of his shorter novels, so I feel like at some point I may just pick it up just because it's short and just see how it goes. But anyway, yeah, nothing about that one. Next is one of my favorite books of all time, and that is Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I actually have 2 copies, so there's that one, but I'll just hold this one. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which follows a girl named Tess who is a dairymaid, and she ends up being put in a situation where she is raped by a wealthy man. On that, I will say that there are a lot of people, it's very ambiguous as to what exactly happens, whether it was consensual or whether it wasn't. Personally, all context clues for me point to it being non-consensual. However, since it's so ambiguous, some people are like, well, it could have been consensual. Again, Tess clearly doesn't really like the man. She also is very much an innocent person and very much wants to be seen as a lady. And so the idea of her, even if she doesn't understand what's going on, I feel like she would understand enough to know that it's not okay. And so anyway, especially in that society. So personally, I don't think it was consensual. You can read it and see what you think. I think the majority of people I talk to, and like in all film adaptations I know of, it's shown as non-consensual. But anyway, that's like a debate that I don't think should be a debate. But anyway, that's a different story. I really, really love this book. It is a tragedy, not a happy ending, but I found it so beautiful, especially at this time period. It shows an understanding of what a lot of the lower classes had to experience, and how at that time Hardy's very realistic in a lot of his books on how things would actually be able to work out. Like even though he has strong women who are intelligent, he only has them rise in society as much as they potentially could in reality at that time. And so with like things like this, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't like give Tess a happy ending. He's like, in her situation, she just wouldn't get a happy ending. In that culture, in that society at that time, it wasn't going to happen. And so I love that he's very brutally honest like that, and I love Tess as a character. I love her innocence and yet strong will throughout it. I love this book so much. It's a longer one, so you may not want to start here, but I started here and I'm glad I did, because I feel like it helped me fall in love with Hardy, and then I was able to continue on from there and just fall even more in love with Hardy. So after the publication of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Hardy received a lot of flack for that book, just because it was on the border of being very inappropriate for the time, particularly with the rape and everything. And so while it was definitely one of his most popular and one of his most successful novels of all time, he still received a lot of criticism for it. And so it didn't help when he wrote his next book, which was Jude the Obscure. I don't know a ton about this beyond that it's about this poor man named Jude who has dreams of going to university and of getting an education, but he is not given that opportunity. He also ends up in a loveless marriage where he's very unhappy. He falls in love with his cousin, who he ends up not marrying just because of their society. I don't know much more than that, but this book also received a great deal of criticism, and after this he went to just focusing on his poetry because of all the criticism he received. But it is also another one of his most well-known novels. I have heard mixed things about this. Some people felt like it was a little more boring. Some people have felt that it's really good still. So I'm curious to see how I feel about it. I also love this cover. You can't see it super well, but I just love the it's not watercolor, the painting on there, and it just like feels nice. You know when a book, like just the size of it and like the type of paper they use for the cover and stuff just feels nice? That's what this feels like, and I love it. Anyway, so hopefully when I edit this video, it's not going to be terribly long, but there were a lot of books I was going over. So I hope this was a great introduction to Thomas Hardy for you, and hopefully there was one of those books that sounded really intriguing and you would like to pick up. I am going to be continuing to read his books, so maybe at some point in the future, once I finish them all, I'll go through and discuss my in-depth thoughts on all of them. I love Hardy. I love his books. I haven't read very many of his short stories. He has done several short story collections as well as poetry collections, as I've said, which I'd love to try out more of as well. That is it for today's video. Let me know down below if you've read any of Hardy's novels and what you thought of them, as I would love to know, and I will talk to you next week. Bye!